So as you see, my name is Barbara Chandler. I'm a member of Humanist UK and I'm delighted to be here. Quite a shock to be invited to come and give a Zoom talk. It's the first time I've done it without standing at as a celebrant. I'm sorry that I can't see all of you. I can't see any of you, in fact. And I hope you can hear me and see my slides. If you can't, I'm sure that Susan will intervene and stop me. It has to be said that the main title of our subject tonight is a little misleading. It's changed a bit. My original brief has been given different titles at different times. And although I've been asked to speak this month in the run-up to those multiple ceremonies of remembrance in November, for all those who died taking part in warfare, my focus tonight is actually going to be on conscientious objectors. You will see in front of you two columns which I expect most of you know. The middle one, of course, is our cenotaph in London. And to the left of it, in my screen, I hope in yours too, is a second column, also in that same street, which I find so moving every time I go past it that I have to add it today in our illustrations, which is to those women who worked and died in World War II. And then to the right of the screen, we will see again later on, is the memorial in Tavistock Square to those who refused to kill other people. And we'll talk more about that as we go on, of course. I plan to talk on the history of military conscription over the centuries and round the world, and that of conscientious objection to it. In respect of the UK, I'll focus on objection by humanists, and then I'll share that history of that conscientious objectors memorial stone in Tavistock Square, at which the London CO Day memorial event is held every year on International Conscientious Objectors Day, May the 15th. And then I plan to conclude by sharing some current humanist official positions on warfare and on conscientious objection, and by asking your views on whether you think there is a place at all for building a national humanist peace network within Humanist UK. And at that point, of course, I'll welcome lots of discussion insofar as our blended space will allow. And I won't be in charge of that. Susan will, of course. So there's our plan for the evening. So let's look at military conscription through the ages first. We know that the very first piece of conscription that we know about was in the Babylonian Empire, as you see, hundreds of years before the Common Era. It was called Ilkum. I don't know how to pronounce that, I-L-K-U-M. And emperors then required military service in times of war, and during peace, other forms of work for the state. So there was a state demand for war, for both warfare and other work. In return, you got a right to land use. So this was a contract. I give you service, you give me land. And for centuries, that was, right round the world, quite a normal practice for the arrangement of military service. Duties and privileges were exchanged. In feudal Europe, there developed the idea of military duty tied to loyalty to one's king or one's local lord. And you brought your own weapons and you brought your own armor, depending on your wealth. Medieval Scandinavian leaders required coastal farmers to carry out fighting services, either out on raids or in defense, depending on the season. Those of you who know your Anglo-Saxon or your English medieval history will remember that in 1066, King Harold called out the fyrd. I call it the fyrd. Those of you who know your Anglo-Saxon better than me might pronounce it a different way. It was the English Defence Force, and it was brought in originally against the Vikings and then used by Harold, of course, trying to fight off Norman invaders, and indeed his own brother further north in York when the Battle of Stamford Bridge was fought. It was a system started in which local aldermen or sheriffs would call on every able-bodied free male, and he would come out and join. Over time, this morphed into your thane, and of course, later, after the arrival of William, it turned into the more normal European feudal model. Fines were imposed for failure to carry out the duties, and those who were landowners paid the heaviest fines, and ordinary common labourers the lightest for not turning up. This military requirement, linked both to personal loyalty and to reward and punishment, was all in the context worldwide of frequent battles between communities, or more often their elites, for possession of territory, wealth, goods, agricultural product, and of course women and children, and naturally also for the defense of those same elements. In the Middle East, we now have the question of slavery. Slavery was, of course, we remember, a widespread and accepted phenomenon worldwide, right up until the last century, and some would say it's still being tolerated today in many forms. The Roman Empire used slaves in warfare, but only as volunteers, and if you were a slave called on to volunteer, and you did, the likelihood would be that you would get your freedom if you survived that battle. We haven't got any record of slaves being required to fight in warfare in Europe, but as I've said, from 200 years before Christ, right up to the 14th century, military slavery was used, both children and adults, and the idea would be that they would be forcibly converted to Islam and then forcibly served in the armies of the then Islamic Caliphate, the Abbasids. Modern conscription, we're much more familiar with. It started with the French Revolution. After the success of the revolution locally, the governors of France were frightened that the monarchies around them would come and stop them, and so they started their first enlistment, the levée en masse. Russia used a form of conscription, tied once again to land and to the Russian form of slavery, serfdom. They had a draconian length of service, 25 years in the first instance. It was only reduced to 20 years in the 19th century. So conscription with exemption on particular grounds, such as age or infirmity, overwhelming family or agricultural duty, incarceration, or previous military service, has been a widespread technique throughout recorded history for ensuring that leaders could have followers to help them gain and maintain power. But what happens if you want to avoid fighting? The most obvious method, which is still in use today, as we know from the arrival of many refugees on our shores, is to run away. If you're lucky enough to have friends and family over the border and money to help you get away, then you're likely never to serve, though your life's trajectory might be completely transformed. On the other hand, a draconian military organization can take measures against those left behind, so such an approach might be extremely dangerous. Another popular method for avoiding fighting, of course, is to pay your way out of it. As we've seen, it was well established centuries ago, and many of the older systems of conscription included legal ways to pay your way out of this, with set sums of money fixed. And of course, provided the punishment is bearable for you, you might just make a stand, refuse to fight, and live with the consequences. And why might you not want to fight? the most obvious reason, of course, about yourself. You don't want to get killed or maimed or leave your poor wife and family, your aged parents and your hometown to the tender mercies of those left behind or whoever might turn up while you're gone. So you have every reason to be afraid, personally. But we're concerned today with the less self-preserving reasons for not wanting to join the military, the militia, or the scratch defense force. That's to say, you don't want to kill other people or maim them or destroy their homelands. So we come to this notion on our screen of conscientious objection. We should distinguish, I think, between objection that is absolute, that is meaning no cooperation whatsoever with the conscription system or any part of it, or relative, meaning that you will accept some form of service as long as you're not having to do military combat duties like an ambulance service or medical work. But of course, there's also another technique, approach to objection, and that's what we might call selective objection as opposed to absolute objection. And selective objection is distinct from pacifism in that it says, I have no opposition to killing in principle. That's not my problem. But I hate the thought of this war in these circumstances, and I'm not prepared to get involved. Now, we will remember Muhammad Ali, who in being called up for the Vietnam War, refused, was at first given a 5-year prison sentence, and in the battle not to go to jail, and in fact he did win his case eventually in the Supreme Court, he lost all his existing boxing titles and years of professional opportunity. He most eloquently expressed his specific objection. He said, and I'm going to quote him because I love his quote, "My conscience won't let me go shoot my brother or some darker people or some poor hungry people in the mud for big, powerful America. And shoot them for what? They never called me nigger. They never lynched me. They didn't put no dogs on me. They didn't rob me of my nationality, rape and kill my mother and father. Shoot them for what? How can I shoot them poor people? Just take me to jail." It was a lovely expression of a specific objection to a war. He actually won his case on the more general ground that he had a religious objection. The Nation of Islam told him that he could only do a war that was called on by Allah. And under this, he won his case at the Supreme Court. One suspects his response might have been rather different if it had been a different war. But we don't know. We shall never know. The issue of selectivity is a quite important one for any thinking person. When you're facing a decision about whether you want to be involved in warfare, what that war is really matters. If my religion or my belief doesn't tell me to be an absolute pacifist, I must make up my mind each time I'm asked to serve in the military. Is this a just war? Do I, in this particular instance, believe that it's right to participate in taking the lives of people who I've never met, have no special reason to condemn? Is the cause great enough to justify that? States which have decided that they need to conscript military forces, of course, don't like selective objection very much. Over much of history, where conscientious objections have been honoured, these have been almost entirely on pacifist religious grounds. Only since the 20th century have these acceptable grounds been broad enough to include non-religious objection, and none of them have been permitted of specific objection. Those with non-religious or selective and absolutist objections have generally had very short shrift. Some specific religious communities by tradition over the centuries and across the world have been seen to be refusers of military service. The traditional so-called peace churches have claimed their rights throughout the world. And here's a list, not an inclusive list, but the list of those best known. And in fact, the most ancient of them that we know of are the Mennonites, and we'll come back to those in a while. In searching tonight, I also discovered that Baha'i, there is actually a Baha'i community quite near where I live, and I notice it as I go past. I didn't realize, it was in researching for this that I realized, that Baha'i sees non-violence as its supreme religion. Do not injure, abuse, oppress, enslave, insult, torment, torture, or kill any creature or any living being, Baha'i teaches. And Jainism, non-violence is the supreme religion. I'm so sorry, I've quoted Jainism when I should have. I've mentioned Jainism and quoted it as though it were the Baha'i viewpoint. I do apologize. So it's Jainism that says this lovely thing about not injuring, abusing, oppressing, or enslaving. I do beg your pardon. Now, I looked in vain for evidence of actual examples of Buddhist conscientious objection. And in spite of its reputation in the Western world for being all about peace and its explicit teaching, avoid killing or harming any living thing, we find it's not quite like that. And those of you who've been following what's going on in Myanmar will probably know that already. I found an article by Michael Jerrison of the University of Ohio in a digital magazine called Aeon. I shall give you the references later. And he points out that Buddhism claims to be essentially a peaceful tradition, but it is a full-blooded religion whose adherents are eager to protect it. For example, during the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 05, Rinzai Buddhist monks spoke out in favor of the military campaign. For them, the war was a fight for the preservation of civilization, and the Buddhist doctrine, a fight for the world. The Buddhist call to arms reoccurred throughout the Second World War, and Buddhists continue, he claims, to campaign for violence in defense of what they see as threats on their religion. In my searching, I've likewise found no evidence of Sikh, Hindu, or Islamic communities' objections to warfare, nor of those who've refused to fight on religious grounds. No doubt there have been many individuals with these beliefs who have over time refused to be conscripted, but I found no evidence that their institutional leaderships has required or requested or even hinted at this. Now, to illustrate the range of reasons for objection which you might hold and then which might be rejected by the state, I want to show you a list of the reasons given by objectors to military service that were offered by New Zealanders during World War I. It's absolutely fascinating because we actually do have a list of reasons. They were imprisoned as a consequence. First of all, from 1916, the New Zealand government started selecting people by ballot for service overseas in World War I. The government was keen to join the war, but the population wasn't necessarily that keen. While most of the army were volunteers, conscription did need to be called up. They decided they needed conscription as well. Any man aged between 20 and 45 might be called for military service at home or abroad, subject to a medical examination. At first, married men weren't included, and later they were added. And again, some married men were later included, and that pattern was repeated in World War II. There was a limited appeals process with hearings, however, local to you in public in front of the press. So if you objected and you failed, everything that you'd had to say and the judgment against you would be known to everybody you shared your home with. Most appeals were on the grounds that the men concerned performed essential work, and they were often supported by employers. Trade unionism was very strong in New Zealand at that time. Balloted men who failed to present themselves for service could be imprisoned immediately with hard labour for up to 5 years, and employers could be prosecuted for hiring someone who should have been called up. The state decided to permit some conscientious objection on religious grounds, but only through membership of a recognised pacifist sect. So we know about 600 men declared conscientious objection. Not all of them had that accepted. 286 of them were ultimately imprisoned. Many of the others accepted non-combatant service or were exempt from service because it was found that their appeal was accepted. But 14 imprisoned objectors were in fact forcibly dispatched overseas, subjected to military punishments and imprisoned overseas. At the end of both the First and the Second World Wars, some objectors whose reasons were not accepted were denied voting rights for 10 years. What's interesting to us, given that we're not religious, so we're interested in conscientious objectors who weren't, the range of reasons that were given for objecting to conscription are the things that we found interesting. You can see, I hope, and I'm moving on to a chart here. I do hope you can see it. Those of you who can see it, and you're sitting near somebody who can't, please tell them what you're seeing. Nearly half claimed exemption on religious grounds, but were still in prison, so their grounds were not considered strong enough. But so many other reasons were given. 20 people were claiming to be non-religious, but we don't know what their ethical objection was. A whole 59 were socialists. They were refusing to fight on the grounds this was a capitalist and colonialist enterprise, World War I, so they didn't see why they should get involved. Those of Irish origin, with their long history of discord between Britain and Ireland, refused to join the British cause. Some Waikato Maoris, who were traditionally often at odds with their colonial neighbours, also objected on their own grounds. So you can see that when we talk about conscientious objection and sharply distinguish pacifism from a selective ethical objection, suddenly there comes a range of considered views which can lead people to refuse, to say, no, I'm not going to do this. I'm going to move on now to look at conscientious objection itself over our known historical time. The first recorded conscientious objector, very famous, was Maximilianus, who during the Roman control over Algeria in the 3rd century refused to join the army on Christian grounds. I'm a Christian, my Christianity tells me I can't. Off with his head. Apparently he was summarily executed immediately. He was later canonized by the Catholic Church. And there are similar stories of similar martyrs in that period. So this is the early days of Christianity, 300 years after Jesus. And one should not be surprised to discover that there were Christians refusing to join the Roman army. A next well-recorded exemption, again on religious grounds, was for the Mennonites in Holland in the 16th century. Interestingly, the founding document of the Dutch Republic, the Union of Utrecht, which was 1579, actually guaranteed all subjects freedom of conscience. stating that nobody shall be persecuted or examined for religious reasons. Mennonites believe that God's peace is most fully revealed in Jesus Christ, and they are responsible for following Christ in the way of peace, doing justice, bringing reconciliation, and practicing non-resistance, even in the face of violence and warfare. And they base it on, love my enemy, turn your face 70 times 7. It's notable that although men were given exemption on, let me just take that one away again, because I can't do that actually. Although men were given exemption on religious grounds, they were also expected to pay a religious tax. Once again, a compromise between the requirement of the state wanting soldiers and these Mennonites saying they didn't intend to fight. And in the context of accepting their right to religious objection, the Dutch simply took a tax. In the 18th century, when Britain established its first militia force, the Militia Ballot Act, which established a technique for selecting men for availability, gave exemption to Quakers, members of the Society of Friends, but only to them. After the abolition of serfdom, Russia introduced a more modern universal conscription in which male Russian subjects from the age of 20 were to serve in the military for only 6 years, but Mennonites once again were exempted and once again paid a tax. In the early history of the USA, individual colonies offered exemption on religious grounds to the Mennonites, the Quakers, the Church of the Brethren, the Adventists, and Jehovah's Witnesses. And then, I thought it was very funny, as soon as warfare broke out, the first one, Rhode Island, actually revoked its religious exemption almost immediately. But during the Civil War itself, there was not only the first national draft, but also the first national recognition of conscientious objection. But only members of these well-known so-called peace churches were eligible. Well into the 20th century, most American pacifists were religious, but there were small groups of secular pacifists and anti-military socialists. None of them were eligible for any sort of official exemption from military service. Well into the 20th century, so until the mid-20th century, and in most countries, only religious grounds for exemption were well established. But now we come to 1948. Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the United Nations. This at last established the right to manifest one's religion or belief. And this includes the right to do so in observance, that is to say, acting in obedience to the rules of one's religion or belief. A French law of 1963 gave legal recognition to both religious and philosophical objections at last, providing both non-combatant and alternative civilian service, but a term of service for those who've refused twice the length of the military one. And once again, that's another common pattern. We've called you up for 3 years or maybe 2 years, but you'll do double that if you refuse and go for an alternative. This is an interesting one I've got up on the screen now. In 1978, a very specific right to be exempt was added by the United Nations, the right of all persons to refuse service in military or police forces which are used to enforce apartheid. It's interesting to think here that we've not just got recognition of total objection, but of a selective objection on the grounds, no doubt, of the current illegality of the apartheid regime in the eyes of those in the United Nations who were looking out for human rights. Very interesting, however, it was the only example I found of a very specific permission, if you like, a right to refuse to serve. Further, in later exemptions, in later Commission, UNHCR resolutions, we find persons performing military service should not be excluded from the right to have conscientious objection to military service. And they said it again, rather later they reinforced it. The right to have conscientious objection to military service is a legitimate exercise of the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. And later that same document, persons already performing military service may develop conscientious objections. This is a whole extra field. This is not about conscription. You might be a volunteer and you might develop your conscience, may take you to a place where you can no longer see yourself capable of fighting in all honesty. And the United Nations has issued that human right is to be able to say you can exercise that as far as they're concerned. Doing it is another matter. And even in Britain, it's well known that it's quite sticky trying to prove that. So let's now look at the current state of conscription and exemption from conscription across the world. This is the map produced by Statista, which is a commercial online resource of statistics, which they develop into charts and into maps like this one. So you can see the grey area says, sorry, there's no conscription at all. Here's Greenland and Iceland, they don't conscript. Not sure about this one. Not sure whether that's true still. And of course, this is Western, is it called Western Africa? Anyway, it's certainly a disputed territory between Morocco and itself. So we don't know about that. The blue area is no conscription. The yellow area is a limited conscription. Orange plans to abolish it, and red are those areas which still have widespread conscription. You'll notice that Finland is included in that. I'm made a little bit uneasy by the inclusion of the United States in this category of blue, of no conscription. You may not be aware of this, but I am. There continues to be a nationwide registration of all adult males. It's called the Selective Service System. And it's there in preparation for that time when America might call on men again to fight in some war. Most of us oldies will remember that the draft was avoided and protested so much during the Vietnam War, and this led to a decision not to have a standing conscripted army. And America, of course, now has only a volunteer army. But they reserve the right to call on their citizens should they wish to. And I hear tell that, like Israel and Norway and Eritrea, America will in future choose not to be sexist in drafting conscripted soldiers. The plan is to have a selection system which also makes sure that women go on the list. In exploring current conscription, I was struck by the distinction between two approaches. On the one hand, many European countries, which still have some form of routine recruitment, provide scope for exemption broadly on the grounds approved by the United Nations. So this does include humanists. And they offer alternatives to objectors. However, the second group, including, for example, Eritrea and South Korea, not only recruit routinely, but also offer precious little comfort to anyone who wishes not to kill on the state's behalf on any ground at all. Oh, except that in South Korea, if you're a pop star or a leading international athlete, you can be exempted. hundreds of people worldwide. I don't know how many. Amnesty keeps trying to keep touch with them. War Resisters International keeps. There is no count of how many people are currently imprisoned for rejecting conscription or for leaving the armed forces, having developed a conscientious objection. We just don't know, but we do know it's in the hundreds. And of course, others will find themselves given other egregious consequences. A Quaker document, this is from the Quaker document for the United Nations, lists the sorts of things that can happen to you having objected. Several implications beyond prosecution and imprisonment for unrecognised conscientious objectors when they refuse military service. So you refuse military service, it's not recognised. First of all, of course, you may well be imprisoned, you may acquire a criminal record. But the other things that get doled out to you are remarkably frightening, really. You don't get allowed to have the right kind of identification documentation. You have restrictions on enjoyment of your civil rights. So, for example, like the New Zealand example, you're stopped from voting. As a consequence of lack of documentation, you'll have limited employment opportunities and you'll have an inability to access or complete your education. And you may well not only not be allowed to leave the country, but in some instances, not allowed to leave your home. Oh, I've gone back. I must go back. I'm going to give you some very specific examples now, and I notice time is ticking on, so I'll just choose one. Who shall I choose? South Korea, Singapore, Eritrea, or Greece? I think I'll go to Singapore, because I think Singapore, we think of Singapore as such an orderly country, such a lovely place to go and visit. In Singapore, the right to conscientious objection isn't legally recognised at all. There are no provisions for substitute service. Its government says no Singaporean should be allowed to cite any reason to exempt himself from having to contribute to national defence effort, as every Singaporean benefits from the peace and security which national service has helped to ensure. Wikipedia reports as follows. Normally, objectors are tried in military courts and usually sentenced to 12 or 15 months military detention. Then they're called up again. A second refusal again results in arrest, charges, custody, and a second court-martial, which leads to another 2 years detention. So the total punishment for refusing to perform military service amounts at least 3 years imprisonment. Now, Singapore did endorse Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, so it's clearly in breach of its United Nations obligations. Another well-known disaster area, of course, is Eritrea, which I won't take you through. South Korea is famous for it. And Greece, much less well-known, is Greece. And in Greece, you can be exempted from 12 months service, mostly on family grounds, like being a widowed father of young children or the only son of elderly parents. But if you want to go to have conscientious objection on religious and ethical grounds, although in theory it's possible, in practice it's almost impossible. And as we speak, this battle is being fought by a variety of NGOs, both within and without Greece, trying to get them to come to terms with actually allowing people to make a conscientious objection successfully. In the UK, of course, we want to look at anti-war humanists in our history. We can't go back very far because non-religious humanists have hardly been able to declare themselves as humanists safely in peacetime, let alone in the face of conscription. And of course, it's only very recently that you've been able to do this freely. Humanist UK, our heritage coordinator, Maddie Goodall, assembled a helpful document on the record of humanists in recent warfare, and I've unashamedly borrowed from her work. First, of course, well known to any of you who've done any peace campaigning at all or were wide awake in the 50s is Bertrand Russell. He was actually a member of the Humanist UK Advisory Council, and he was president of Cardiff Humanists. He was an active pacifist during World War I and dismissed from Trinity College, Cambridge after being convicted under the Defence of the Realm Act 1914. So he's a very striking example, and of course remained a pacifist and an active campaigner against nuclear weapons throughout his life. Francis Shears Skeffington, slightly different character. He was an Irish patriot, a socialist, a pacifist, and a feminist. He wasn't so well known, partly probably because he was Irish. He was arrested and imprisoned in 1915 after lecturing repeatedly against war. And once again, we come to the Irish issue, urging Irishmen not to enlist. He was executed in 1916 during the Easter Rising. His son, Owen Shears Skeffington, helped to found the Humanist Association of Ireland. We have E.M. Forster, another extremely well-known name, a lifelong humanist, a vice president of the Ethical Union, which was now Humanist UK, and he was also a conscientious objector during World War I. He served as a searcher for the British Red Cross in Egypt during World War I, interviewing the wounded in hospitals for information about people reported missing. Another famous name, Fenner Brockway, lifelong socialist, humanist, anti-racist, peace campaigner, founded the No Conscription Fellowship in 1914 at the suggestion of his wife Lilla, alongside Bertrand Russell, founding member of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament and a member of the Advisory Council of Humanists UK. We have Peter Huneau, later example, a social scientist and activist, and at the outbreak of World War II, he first joined the Battersea Civil Defence Services and then became a conscientious objector and a representative for civil defence workers on the board for conscientious objectors. He was later editor of the Ethical Record, the journal of the South Place Ethical Society. And we come, of course, to Edna Matheson, the niece of conscientious objector Joe Brett, and I will talk about those two in a minute. In World War I, but I haven't found anything from them in World War II. I recommend those who want to go into this have a good look at the whole of their document. It's quite lengthy and wordy, so I'll only share this one section with you. We protest against the infamy of war. We can proclaim our unquenchable faith in the power of human spirit and reason to discover new methods of dealing with international difficulties, that this curse may gradually be swept away from the face of this earth. This group did not go so far as to call for conscientious objection. Rather, they called for radical changes in education, democratic accountability, and international diplomacy, which might lead to worldwide rejection of war. I talked about Joseph Brett. Edna Matheson and Joseph Brett. So sorry, folks. What have I done to myself? Joseph Brett was imprisoned in 1916 for refusing to fight in World War I. He was the uncle of a humanist and a National Secular Society member, Edna Matheson. And she said he'd been a lifelong socialist and because of those principles became a conscientious objector in the war. He had chosen Tom Paine's simple words to express what he believed. the world is my country, all men are my brothers, to do good is my religion. And the idea of having a stone dedicated to conscientious objectors began in 1976 at Joseph's funeral. Bill McIlroy, the then secretary of the NSS, he officiated at this, and he commented that perhaps one day conscientious objectors would be commemorated as armed forces personnel are, both nationally and locally, in the places where they lived. And Edna picked up on the idea, and once she became a member of ILIA, which she did in 1981, she started her really long campaign to get a memorial built. She was supported by the NSS, then the Police Pledge Union, whose president was Sir Michael Tippett, the composer and a World War II conscientious objector. On the 15th of May, 1993, so 12 years later, on International Conscientious Objectors Day, a public appeal to gain funds was launched by a letter in The Guardian. And the BHA then started to contribute generously, as of course did many individuals. And the Peace Garden in Tavistock Square was the obvious location for it, and Camden Council was happy to host it. And the stone was unveiled in 1994, of course. For all those who've established and are maintaining the right to refuse to kill, their foresight and courage give us hope. To commemorate, says round the edges, to commemorate men and women, conscientious objectors to military service all over the world and in every age. In 1998, Edna went further and pressed for an annual event for the commemoration of all COs. A planning group met at Conway Hall with the help of both the then BHA and the NSS, whose offices were there at the time. And ever since, there's been an annual memorial event held at the Stone every year on the 15th of May, where amongst speeches, songs, and commemorative silence, the names of 100 conscientious objectors from around the world are read out as tokens for everyone, and each is honoured with a white flower laid at the stone. There's not much history to International Conscientious Objectors Day itself. It was first observed in 1982 by Western European objectors led by War Resisters International. And the date was simply one that was convenient for them all, and it got fixed. I think it's a lovely story. Nothing but convenience made that date. So where do humanist organizations stand today on all these issues? The National Ethical Service in the United States, which is an umbrella organization for those who have a non-religious ethical commitment to the world, simply say they're committed to a culture of peace. The American Humanists Association, while humanists generally don't take a peace at any cost view, we do recognize that just wars have been extraordinarily rare in human history. Humanist Society Scotland, more detailed, Humanist emphasizes the importance of careful and reasoned consideration of all alternatives to war and believe in the need for international cooperation to prevent the escalation of conflict and violence. Finally, Humanists UK, there is no universally agreed humanist perspective on war. You'll notice I haven't attempted an ethical discussion about whether we should or shouldn't, as individuals, decide to support our state's military activity. While I'm not asking us to discuss that in detail, these philosophical issues, they will, of course, inevitably arise. Is being a humanist a natural companion to campaigning against conscription and against warfare? Given the published humanist position, is there a place at all for a dedicated peace network, which is part of Humanists UK? So when you go to have your cup of tea, your glass of wine or your break from your computer now, I'll be ever so glad if you come back and share your thoughts on these things. Thank you very much, and I'll hand back to Susan.